and he brings it alive. I don't know how he's going to condense this into whatever the time is going to be that we have, but hopefully you'll walk away inspired and ready to do some more reading and inquiry about how amazing the Berkshires were during that time. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Shirley, for the introduction, and I'm pleased as punch to be giving this lecture. The whole premise behind having it here was hopefully we were going to have some air conditioning, but gosh, it wouldn't be Simon's Rock if one thing, didn't go off the rails a little bit. So we'll do what we can, and I'll try to be brief and concise. I have the pleasure of delivering a series of weekly lectures for my course, American Revolutions, The Nation's Unfinished Promise, this past semester at Simon's Rock. And I am not a specialist on the American Revolution, although I know a bit about it, and of course study with some amazing historians, including historians of the Revolution. And I was just dumbfounded. I was awestruck. I was thrilled to realize how much history of the American Revolution actually plays out right here in Berkshire County. And so what you're about to receive is essentially like the greatest hits of this lecture series. And I will do my best to kind of summarize those things and make it as concise as possible. Of course, I can't go into the level of depth that I did for the lecture this spring, but we'll see what we can do here. So I have my notes on my computer, and I have these beautiful, very aesthetically pleasing slides that I have crafted for you, and I will do my best to kind of go back and forth between them. But all academic lectures have, like a couple of arguments and points, and this is what I'd like to drive home for you today. We tend to think of the history of the American Revolution as a national story for all the obvious reasons, right? It's the creation of the United States, it's the creation of a new American identity from what exists before that, which is primarily, but not exclusively, British, right? Obviously, it leads to American political institutions, above all, the Constitution of the United States, right, by 1788. We tend to think of it in that way. And that's how we tend to read and write our histories of this monumental event, not just in the history of North America, but the world, right? And yet, I'm going to suggest to you the case of Berkshire County teaches us that all history is local. National history, even global history, happens somewhere, right? And what I've discovered is that Berkshire County really is a hotbed of revolutionary activity, agitation, politics, and what we call the settlement of the revolution, the aftermath, how issues of power get decided. So some of you from Massachusetts may remember this old chap, Tip O'Neill, right? Speaker of the House during the 80s, he said all politics is local. I'm going to say to you, all history is local. And we might even go beyond that and say all revolutions happen locally. Right? Even if they make a nation, even if they happen on a national framework, and the history of the American Revolution is truly global. It plays out across the world, in fact, because it drags in the other great European powers, France, Spain, right? In a system of kind of imperial competition, right? All revolutions play out locally, and that's the case here. So next time you're tempted to go to the Freedom Trail, just remember you can take a daily excursion on a Saturday or a Sunday and see the revolution and its history right here in Berkshire County. Second, how we remember history really matters. And part of what this class does, and part of what I'm going to talk about today, is how we remember the revolution and why we remember the revolution the way that we do, and we'll go into that a little bit. And then third and lastly, I am an academic. I love history for its own sake, for its own right. But the history of the American Revolution, I'm going to submit to you, is a history that speaks to us today. And that's why it makes it so important and essential that we understand it, right? This is not just something that happened 250 years ago. Those events shape our daily lives, and they teach the power of when people try to have more control over their own daily lives and their decision making, right? The opportunities available for them. And so I'll also say that Berkshire County teaches us that the revolution is about all kinds of Americans, no matter what you look like, or your political creed, right, or your religious faith. It's a story that involves everyone, and you see that right here in Berkshire County. It's not just those old chaps with wigs, the powdered wigs, right, who sign their names on the Declaration or at the Constitutional Convention. And so I hope, to impart that for you today as much as we can. This clicker works. That's a good sign. Here it sounds wrong. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the revolution as an idea. Mostly what we learn about the American Revolution, if we learn anything about it at all, and I think we still do here in America, we think of it as a set of ideas, a set of principles, political ideas and political philosophies. And we see that in a couple of core documents. Of course, the one we most associate with the revolution, what we will be celebrating next week, and then celebrating next year, the 250th anniversary of that, principally in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence, right? I don't think I need to review for you, all of you, everything about the Declaration, but suffice to say, the Declaration has a core set of what we would call classically liberal ideas. And by liberal, I don't mean Democratic Party or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean liberal in terms of classical political philosophy, okay? And you know that from the Declaration, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. There's this idea of equality, right? That has to do with the American colonists, who's principally Thomas Jefferson, right? Drafting this document saying we are equal here in America to men in Great Britain, right? We deserve as much political rights and representation as a man born in Manchester, right, or Birmingham or London. That's that kind of liberal philosophy. And then there's these rights, obviously these inalienable rights, right, which Jefferson says all men have, right? You know it, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now those are also classic liberal ideas, some of it based on what we call social contract theory, this idea that government is a contract between people. Those are really important ideas for the revolution, right? And they go all the way back in English philosophy to really, really important thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, right, who says that people exist, he says men, but people exist in a state of nature, right, which is just kind of anarchy, and government forms to protect your life, right? He's thinking about the English Civil War of the 1640s, right, that gets rid of King Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, the Republicans. He's followed by John Locke, right? Maybe you've heard of him. He writes the two treatises on government. Locke says governments exist not only to protect your life, but to protect your liberties, your political rights, right? Particularly in Locke's mind, this idea that Parliament has a right to decide taxation, right? Taxation, right? And that's where his last right, Locke's right, comes in, property. He says men have a right to form governments to protect their lives, their liberties, and their property, right? Famously, Thomas Jefferson. That makes him a little squeamish, you know? He has a peculiar species of property too, which we won't go into in too much detail, in his plantation in Virginia, not unlike many men at the time. But Jefferson is squeamish, and he says, no, we're going to turn property into the pursuit of happiness, right? We know these classical liberal ideas, which become universal ideals because of the Declaration of Independence, ideals that are the foundation of our political identity, our way of life here in America. We think they are first enunciated truly by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. But wait a minute, you've got to back up. Thomas Jefferson is part of the Virginia legislature. He's an educated man. He's been politically active in Virginia before that. Okay? And in 1774, in fact, he writes a document that becomes the basis of the Declaration. It's called A Summary of the Rights of British America, and it's written from the perspective of the Virginia Colonial Assembly, where he's important. So it's a protest of the Virginia Colonial Assembly. Much of the ideas that go into the Declaration are articulated there. But then you say, Justin, that's not really the first time that Americans circulate this classical statement of ideals. Why? How do we know that? Because in fact, right here in Berkshire County, and I was just thrilled to find this out, right here in Sheffield, Sheffield, in January of 1773, the white male voters, property holders in Sheffield, have issued something called the Sheffield Resolves. Sometimes it's called the Sheffield Declaration, but I think that just gets people confused. So let's call it the Sheffield Resolves, okay? What is the Sheffield Resolves, right? The Sheffield Resolves, this is one of the first statements issued by the people of Massachusetts as they're responding to a series of events, a series of policies coming from Parliament and the King, and a series of acts of resistance to that. That's centered, yes, I get it, in Boston, but is playing out all across the Massachusetts Bay Colony and New England in important ways. Okay, let's get into the Sheffield Resolve really quickly, right? Jefferson in the Summary View says that, quote, rights are derived from the laws of nature and are given by God to all people. Rights like free trade with all parts of the world, natural right that's been cut off in Great Britain. The king and the parliament have engaged in a series of oppressions. He suspended colonial legislatures. By this time, you know, in 74, the king has shut down the Massachusetts provincial government, etc., etc., etc. Well, the Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence in Boston had already asked people in Massachusetts to act on these sentiments, and the voters of Sheffield get together, okay, to precisely issue their protest statement. In November of 1772, a Boston town meeting, right, forms what's called the Committee of Correspondence, and here they're protesting the King's Tea Act that will lead by the next year to the Tea Party, and they open communication with other Massachusetts towns. And they insist on colonist rights as men, Christians, and subjects, and they're directly channeling Locke's philosophy. But they also call for a statement of rights from each Massachusetts town. And this is what happens here in Sheffield. In Sheffield, men who are farmers here, you know, in the winter, there's not much to do, right? This is the time of year when you've stopped taking care of your fields and you're just taking care of your livestock. They get together and vote on these Sheffield Resolves. Why do I have this image of downtown Sheffield? Does anybody know what that white building is right there? The First Congregational Church of Sheffield. You can go there today. New England is essentially as about as close as America's gotten to a theocracy at this time, and every town has what we call a congregational church. These are the original separatists. We call them Puritans. Right? And that also usually doubles as the town meeting hall, the town hall where you conduct government business. And so, in fact, the men of Sheffield gathered to vote on these resolves in January of 1773. Now, local lore has that the resolves happened at Colonel John Ashley's house. We're going to talk about him more in a minute. Colonel John Ashley, extremely important. Local notable businessman, a militia colonel in Ashley Falls. In fact, the resolves are only drafted there. Why is it so important that we go to the First Congregational Church and check this out? Because elites like Ashley, they may be reading Locke, but the common New England farmer probably isn't reading John Locke's treatises. He's probably reading sheep. If they're reading at all on a daily basis, it's one book. I'm guessing many of you can know what that book is. The Bible. That's what they're reading. And so Ashley and men around him, they may be familiar with these political philosophies. But to get the town to vote on it, they have to get all the men in town to vote on it. And so what's happening is these radical ideas of natural rights. You have a right to your life. You have a right to your liberties. You have a right to your property that governments cannot take away from you. They're natural to you. They're God-given, right? And governments only exist. You create them to protect them, and when they stop doing that, what does Jefferson say in the Declaration of Independence? You can get rid of government and start a new one, right? You have to educate the populace about these ideas. That's what's happening in Sheffield on January 12, 1773. And in fact, what is the Sheffield Resolve's first resolution? This was a shocker to me. I hope you can hear what's going on here. They say, mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other. Okay? And they have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and their, yes, you know it, property. Property. Right? These good men of Sheffield, they are essentially taking Jefferson's ideas and they are voting on them right here, right? And ratifying them 3 years before Jefferson pens his famous words that the convention in Philadelphia famously signs, right? How do we know this? Because the Sheffield Resolves, after they're voted, is one of the few of these declarations. There are many declarations, in fact, throughout Massachusetts that are much like the Resolve, the Sheffield document, but it's one of the few that's actually published. Because these Massachusetts farmers, some of whom are going to be Minutemen very soon, if they're not reading the Bible, they're reading the newspaper, right? And America, unlike England, unlike France, has a very vibrant newspaper culture, right? And all these men who are literate so they can go worship at the Congregational Church, they're often reading the newspaper. So the Sheffield Resolves, really, 3 years before the Declaration, has articulated these classical ideals of the American Revolution principles right here in Sheffield. Now, if we focus on political ideas of the Revolution, we tend to get, I would say, the very traditional, conventional view of the American Revolution. That was just a bunch of very intelligent, educated, hyper-educated, literate men, gathering in Philadelphia and Washington, framing these perfect political documents, right? And the image you get from that story of the American Revolution is that it's just a mental activity. It's just an intellectual demonstration. But of course we know, because we've been thinking about the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, right, that this revolution becomes violent. And it takes a war, a very bloody, long war, 1775 to 1781, right? It's not even settled, in fact, till 83. Very long and bloody war to settle this question of independence and separation from England. In fact, one reason we focus on Boston is because ideas don't just come out of anywhere. Ideas come out of struggle and contest and conflict. That's how ideas become important, right? I hope, right, that it's not just the Declaration of Independence, right? It's a series of events of protests against British policies that build up to Lexington and Concord, that build up to the Declaration of Independence. And if we focus on that, if we focus on the history of Boston, we can understand that there's what you might call a social history, right? There's a bottom-up and not just a top-down, but a bottom-up history to the origins of the American Revolution, which is fascinating and also terrifying. Terrifying because men like John Adams really understand, right, that when the masses down here, right, take control of events, things get out of control quickly, right? You need leadership, you need order and discipline. And in fact, the history of the revolution is not just top-down, it's bottom-up, and it is that way from the very beginning. This image on the left, this is a famous engraving, not celebrating, but criticizing American colonials in Boston for doing what? You probably heard of this, tarring and feathering. And who are they tarring and feathering? This is a stamp collector. In 1764, the event that really touches off the revolution, Parliament needs to rapidly collect revenue to pay off the debts of the French and Indian War, right? Britain has a huge debt. They just spent all this blood and treasure protecting the American colonies from the French and the Indians. We call it the French and Indian War. The polite term today is the 7 Years' War, right? And American colonists freak out, as we say. They freak out. Why? Because this Stamp Act that Parliament is collecting is a direct tax. It's a tax on everyday life and activity here in America. And all taxes that had come from Parliament before that are what we call indirect taxes. A tax purely on external trade, trade between the colonies and London, trade between the colonies and Europe, right? And so the Stamp Act immediately infuriates not just elites, but just ordinary people. Why? Because this is not a mailing stamp like you pay for postage. This is a metal stamp that has to be pressed onto every piece of paper that's transacted in the colonies. Everything that's printed, everything that's purchased, wedding licenses, birth certificates, you name it, all legal documents, all newspapers, all books, everything has to pay it. And thus, you've gone from taxing just merchants like John Hancock, the dude with the big signature, right? Smuggler, by the way. You've gone from taxing him to taxing everybody who transacts paper. And so this outrages colonists. Well, why does this start in Boston? Because it's not just men like James Otis or John Adams who are upset about the Stamp Act. They connect with street ruffians. And in Boston is pretty much run by gangs. And there's a gang on the north end, a gang on the south end. And every Guy Fawkes Day, every November, to celebrate the defeat of the Papist Catholic conspiracy to overthrow the Protestant monarchy, right? These gangs get together and they beat the living heck out of each other. I can't say more than that because it's Sunday. But they really do a number on each other. And this is kind of a big excuse for them to get very inebriated. It's a social activity. But essentially, what happens is a man named Samuel Adams, right? A guy named Paul Revere, who's a bit kind of a working man himself. They connect with these street ruffians and they recruit them to a new organization, which you probably heard of, the Sons of Liberty. And it's the connection between these elite leaders and this kind of poor and artisan mechanic class, right? That starts to produce real friction and resistance. And yes, they start by beating up and terrorizing and intimidating stamp collectors like Mr. Gordon here. But it escalates quickly, right? The revolution is not a tea party. It's not a parliamentary affair. It's very violent and messy and ugly. In 1765, to protest the Stamp Act, they pulled down and burned the house of the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Hutchinson. They pulled it down in 6 hours. They cleaned out the whole house, tore it down, and then burned it, right? And that's the British colonial governor. So, you know, this is, yes, protest, but it's also a little out of control. Well, I was shocked to find that, in fact, you know, here in Berkshire County, we pride ourselves on being very peaceful and sedate people. But in fact, as the revolutionary crisis escalates, right, as these incidents happen in Boston, right, to protest, not the Stamp Act, that's repealed in 1766, not the Townshend duties of 1768, that's repealed by 1770, right, but the Tea Act, right, as these incidents escalate, right, here in Berkshire County, people are called on to resist government authority, parliamentary authority, British authority, and they do, right? We know what happens in Boston. You've heard of the Boston Massacre, right, which is in some ways resistance to British military occupation. That's 1770. March, you know the Tea Party, December 1773. That's when the Boston colonists protest the tea tax, which is the remaining tax on the Townshend duties. But as those protests escalate, right, the British come in and the Parliament passes something called the Massachusetts Government Act, which essentially says, you, Massachusetts colony, you no longer get your own independent colonial assembly. We're going to take that away from you. You don't get your own governor. We're going to impose a military occupation on you, and you have a British military governor named Thomas Gage. And once he does that, Gage doesn't completely get rid of this fiction of representation. He in fact appoints men called mandamus counselors. Mandamus counselors. He puts his hand on the counselors. That's that Latin word, mandamus, right? And these mandamus counselors are sort of like an advisory senate who are going to consult him on the best decisions he makes as the executive of the colony, right? But once he appoints these mandamus counselors, it's like he puts a target on their back, right? Because now they're men who are seen as loyal to the crown and its policies. And you have all these revolutionaries and radicals and agitators, we call them patriots, right? Who say, we don't like you, you're cooperating with the parliament. Well, suffice to say, I was totally shocked to find out that all of this agitation, this disorder, right, which is always on the verge of getting out of control, isn't just confined to Boston. It happens right here in Great Barrington. And in fact, by the late 19th century, the people of Great Barrington are a little proud about this. Anybody know where this is? This,
in front of Town Hall.
It's a monument in front of Town Hall, famously hit by a station wagon a couple years ago and chipped. And I think this is the original rock. We've got a new one. I think it's a little easier to read, but sadly overlooked by many people. Sometimes I wonder if the good people of Great Barrington don't want you to see it because it's dangerous. This monument is explosive. What does it say? Near this spot stood the first courthouse of Berkshire County, erected 1764, and here, August 16th, 1774, occurred the first open resistance to British rule in America. Well, first of all, like many monuments, that's false. Right? There's resistance to British rule in different ways, but here they're trying to actually tell us something important, which is that militiamen in Berkshire County came to the courthouse, and some of them had arms. Not even the Boston Tea Party men had arms when they got rid of the tea, right? That massive act of property destruction. Okay? Here, Berkshire militiamen and militiamen from Litchfield County, Connecticut, show up at the courthouse. Okay? And what are they doing in August of '74? This is an incredible moment, Britain, the Parliament, has responded to the Tea Party by imposing something called the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts is not only the Massachusetts government act, getting rid of the colonial assembly, getting rid of representation within your colony, right? If you're a tax-paying white man, right, a Congregationalist, a member of the Congregationalist Church, you get a say, right? You're not only getting rid of that representation, they shut down trade in Boston. So Boston's a trading town, its lifeline is trade. And so now there's essentially an embargo, and there's this military government. And the people of Boston are reaching out to all their neighbors, all their business connections, and their long-distant relatives out here in central and western Massachusetts. And they're asking people to come to their aid, okay? And as they do this in the summer, right, things start to really get very agitated in Boston. Now, typically, historians of the Revolution say the first court closure, the first time that armed militiamen shut down a representative body of British authority, we typically say that's August 30th of 1774. Why? Because that's when men shut down the Boston Superior Courts and they closed it. And in fact, what I discovered, and the good monument tells us this, is the men of Berkshire County do it first. They are the first to shut down British courts in response to the coercive acts, okay? And they've done it immediately after Thomas Gage has appointed these mandamus counselors. So what does a good local history of Great Barrington, Taylor's history, tell us? On August 16th, quote, a very large body of men from all parts of Berkshire County, including 300 to 500 from Litchfield County, assembled at Great Barrington. They took possession of the courthouse. They filled it to overflowing. I mean, imagine, this is a small courthouse. You've got hundreds of militiamen from all over the county and Connecticut crammed into this little room. And they effectually prevented the judges and magistrates from either occupying the building or transacting any business. In vain, the sheriff endeavored to make a passage for the judges, right? But the people knew no court. They recognized in the judges no authority, and they insisted that they should leave the town, which they did. And David Ingersoll, Esquire, a magistrate and prominent Tory of Great Barrington, I hope none of his descendants are here today. I don't mean to embarrass you. He was taken into custody by the Connecticut men, and he was carried off to Litchfield County and imprisoned. My friends, I don't know what that is to you, but to me that sounds like if it happened today, you would be arraigned on what charges? Kidnapping, criminal kidnapping. That's what these men have done. These men of Berkshire County have gone down to the court, they stopped the transactions, and they grabbed the Tory magistrate, and they carried him off to a different colony, to a different province. Well, that's pretty ugly, right? I mean, if that's happening, you can imagine the tensions in small towns like this between patriots, the majority, and a loyalist Tory minority, right? Tensions are very high, tensions are very high. Some of these revolutionary disruptions happen right here, okay? Right here, Great Barrington. This is not the only story locally that we have here. Let's see if my clicker works. Are we done clicking? The battery has given out on us here. What is this? Oh my goodness. And it's Simon Brock. I think one thing doesn't go wrong, another thing has. Yes, the Mohicans, the Mohicans. Folks, I think many of you know that Stockbridge's origins as a town has to do with the so-called Stockbridge mission, right? Well, what is the Stockbridge mission? Why is the mission there, right? Well, it has to do with the fact that this part of Western Massachusetts and going all the way out into the Hudson River Valley is the ancestral historic home of many different Native American groups and nations. The most powerful, the largest, are the Mohicans, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. It's something like Mahicanak. Originally it becomes Mohican, it's anglicized that way. But there's also other groups in this era, this area. The Wappingers, the Housatonics, after which of course the river and valley is named. All of these Native American groups have connections, sometimes conflictual, but mostly peaceful, with the Dutch. The Dutch were the first to colonize the Hudson River Valley, right? By the early 1700s, right, their numbers started to dwindle. They're under pressure from Dutch settlement. The English take over the Dutch colony in the 1660s and 70s, and so they're being pushed out of the Hudson River Valley. They move generally into their winter hunting grounds, which we now call Berkshire County, right? That's where the Mohicans are from originally. By the 1740s, the good people of the Pioneer Valley, where I live in Northampton, have determined they are going to colonize and put a mission in this region to Christianize the Mohicans. John Sargent comes here in the late 1740s and establishes the mission in Stockbridge, and the goal, of course, John Sargent's goal is to propagate Christianity, to educate, civilize, and acculturate the Mohicans. He does quite well, and the Mohicans, compared to other Native American groups in New England, do quite well, right? By the 1740s and 50s, there's about 1,000 in this region. Many of them become, as we call them at this time, praying Indians, right? They are acculturated to Anglo-European ways in some ways. Famously, the great intellectual, spiritual leader of the First Great Awakening, right? The man who really put some spirit into your religion here in America, Jonathan Edwards, goes from Northampton, and briefly he's the minister in Stockbridge in the 1750s before he leaves to become the president of Princeton, which I'm sure you've heard of. Jonathan Edwards comes to Stockbridge. It's a center of hope, actually, between British colonists and Native Americans in New England. But, I'm sad to say, and again, no offense to any descendants here, but very quickly in the 1750s and 60s, there's pressure to find land for young men from, this is an agricultural society, they're looking for land so they can have independence, so they can have a way of sustaining themselves and feeding themselves and their families. They're moving into this region, into Berkshire County. And they congregate around the Stockbridge mission in the 1750s and quickly find clever, devious ways to accumulate the land of the Mohicans. The Mohicans have thousands of acres in what we now call Stockbridge and West Stockbridge. They own a huge percentage of that land. Gradually, through land transactions, becoming in debt to white settlers, to English settlers, to British settlers, alcohol becomes a source of trade, right? You probably imagine the stories, right? These Mohicans start to lose their land. But, despite starting to lose their land as settlers, they are really reliable allies of the British. During the French and Indian War, what I mentioned earlier, the Mohicans are courageous, truly loyal military allies. And that is the case as well in the American Revolution. We forget this. But in fact, the Stockbridge Mohicans form their own company of militiamen in 1775, and it's formed by a man named Daniel Nimham. He is the hereditary chief of the Wappingers, the last. He's part of the Stockbridge community, and his son Abraham. About 100 of the Stockbridge Mohicans respond to the call of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress after Lexington and Concord to send men to Boston. There's a siege of Boston, right? And really, I'm not kidding, 100 of these Stockbridge Mohicans make the trek. They are there at Cambridge, right before the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Thomas Hatton is so upset with these guys. What are they doing? They are the one group of truly sharpshooter riflemen in Washington's army. Washington loves these guys. They're picking off British sentries who are defending the approaches to Boston. Howe hates them. He even says that they have been taught by the Yankee militiamen how to turn their backsides and throw up their pants the British on the siege line. So you can imagine they have a sense of spirit and humor. There's Washington and Cambridge right there. This is the only surviving image we have of a Mohican warrior from the American Revolution. It's one of the few images we have of any Mohicans at all. And this is just an incredible image. You can see he's kind of wearing this kind of light fabric, and he's got his rifle, he's got a hat, and he's got nose earrings, right? That is about the only image we have of the Mohicans. Why do we have this image? Look at this guy's name, Johann Ewald. He's not a British guy. He's a Hessian. He's a German mercenary, hired by the Hanoverian dynasty in England to fight the Americans. Why did he draw this? And I hate to be morbid with you on a Sunday morning, but he has drawn this from a corpse. How did he draw this from a corpse? Well, one of the most tragic events of the American Revolution, which we are connected to right here in Berkshire County, happens with these Stockbridge Mohicans. It's called sometimes the Stockbridge Massacre. It's not really a massacre, it's a battle, it's a small skirmish in northern Manhattan, in that area, what we now call the Bronx. It's out of New York City. And it happens 3 years into the war, August of 1778, and I was shocked to find this out, and perplexed, amazed. The Stockbridge Mohicans, loyal allies, go down fighting. They are being used as scouts. Essentially, they're sent out in front of Washington's army in New York to find the British lines. And they're in this no man's land in the summer of '78, right? They're in this no man's land in what we now call Van Cortlandt's Woods. It's a park today. You can go there, you can see a monument. As they're scouting in front of Washington's lines, they are ambushed by these men in green. This is ironic. These are the Queen's Rangers, and the Queen's Rangers are literally, I'm not making this up, these are the men who are designed by the British Army to imitate Indian fighting. Indian scouting, not fighting in regular formation, right? Thus they have this kind of irregular uniform, green, they're mounted, they have carbines, they go around. They ambush Nimham's company, and they kill almost all of the Stockbridge Mohicans, about 40 at least. And it's almost a massacre. It's a terrible, terrible battle. They decimate the Stockbridge Mohicans. How do you already know the story indirectly. You've seen that terrible Mel Gibson film, Patriot. And one man who almost gets killed by Nimham before Nimham himself gets killed is this guy, Banastre Tarleton. And in that Mel Gibson film, Patriot, the evil nemesis of that film is depicting Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton, after this, would go down to South Carolina, and he would engage in what we now call counterinsurgency. He's essentially fighting guerrillas, right? Marion the Swamp Fox, the South Carolina militiamen who are engaged in guerrilla warfare. And he kills civilians. He does some nasty stuff. So do the Americans, but that's okay. But anyways, Tarleton is right there, and he's almost taken out by Nimham. We forget this story because there's no monument to it in Stockbridge. We don't remember the Nimham men. Both Daniel and his son Abraham are killed at Kingsbridge. In fact, there is now more attention on reclaiming the legacy. This is not in Stockbridge, but this incredible statue, which I hope you will take a day to go out to New York to visit. It's not on the side of the battlefield, but it is from where Nimham's originally from, Fishkill, where he's born, right, in that kind of ancestral grounds there. Captures, I think, just incredibly the heroism of these Stockbridge Mohican men in the Revolution. He's got his rifle, he's got a piece of paper, probably, the contract with the Massachusetts colony that they will have, the town of Stockbridge, right? And of course, there's the monument, which you can see today in the Bronx. Of course, the great tragedy is not only that the male warrior men of the Stockbridge community are decimated, right? They come home and they have to fight to be compensated in more than just blankets, right? They have to fight to be compensated, they have to fight to be recognized. And of course, by the late 1780s, they are losing their land. Many of these women and children who are left widowed without their men who they've lost in the war can't survive. And by the end of the 1780s, the Stockbridge Mohicans have moved west into New York. They've essentially moved to a reservation with the Iroquois welcome, and then eventually they will move to, as you know, Wisconsin, where the nation is today. And that's I think one of the great stories, but also the great tragedies of the Revolution. So sorry. I told you it's not just, the men with white powdered wigs, the planters and the merchants, right? It's also about these lower class white folks, these working class and poor white folks. It's about Native Americans. It's also a story right here in Berkshire County about African Americans. It's a story, as we would call it today, about race. It's a story about slavery and freedom. Many of you, I think, may have heard this name, but do you know the full story behind this man, Agrippa Hall? He is one of, and should be known as one of the great heroes of the American Revolution in some ways. Historians today, we know him mostly because he becomes briefly the manservant. Excuse me. I need to go back. He becomes the kind of servant, assistant secretary of Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the great Polish general, right? Who becomes one of the chief engineers for Washington's army, helps to win the Battle of Saratoga, right? Hull is helping Kosciuszko as Kosciuszko is developing a series of defenses that slow down the invasion of 1777. General John Burgoyne tries to split the colonies coming down from Montreal, Canada, down the Hudson River Valley, down the Champlain Valley, to split the colonies from each other, right? Famously, that ends at Saratoga, where he's defeated and surrendered. It's one of the great turning points of the war, maybe the turning point of the war. Who was helping Kosciuszko this whole time? Agrippa Hall, right? And why is that interesting? Agrippa Hall is born a free man in Northampton, my town, where I'm from, in the 1740s, and he, by this time, is living in Stockbridge, where he enlists. He is serving with Washington's Continental Army, and that's how he gets connected with Kosciuszko. Hull becomes a legendary figure in the Continental Army. He's seen as extremely intelligent, extremely hardworking, funny, entertaining. There's this incredible apocryphal story where Kosciuszko says he was at West Point, he left to go hunting for the day, he comes back to his camp and he finds Hull is having a party with all of the black servants and troops of the army. comes back to Stockbridge after the war, famously, and you can go see it today, I encourage you at the Stockbridge Library, famously gets a signature of a discharge paper from George Washington himself that says, you are a soldier, you've been discharged, you have the right in the future possibly to collect a pension, which he does. Paul comes back to Stockbridge. He serves at other battles and other campaigns. He serves in the south at the Battle of Cowpens. He's a nurse. He's helping nurse back to health injured American soldiers there. He comes back to Stockbridge after the war, and famously he becomes one of the largest landowners in Stockbridge. Hundreds of acres. Helps to build homes. He becomes a known carpenter. He becomes an extremely respected member of this community. And of course, this is one of the few images we have of any black man, free or slave, and some slaves did serve in the Revolution, who served in the Revolution. And it's an incredible portrait. You can go see it today in Stockbridge. It's an incredible, incredible story. The tragic part of the story, and I'm sorry to be a Debbie Downer here again, Kosciuszko, this Polish man, he comes to America, this young aristocrat, he sees men like Hall serving in the army, and he says, I want my estate to go towards funding the emancipation of Thomas Jefferson's slaves. And Thomas Jefferson, as the executive of the state, makes that deal. When you die, I'll use the money to emancipate my slaves. I'm sorry to tell you, Thomas Jefferson does not do that. George Washington, to his credit, when he passes his will, all of his slaves are emancipated. Not Thomas's. Not Thomas's. It's an incredible, incredible story. Another incredible story, right, is how far do you want your revolution to go? Who really is sovereign? What is the revolution for, right? Is the revolution for free trade? Is it for merchants? Is it for farmers who don't want to pay taxes? Who is it for? And how are you going to make a revolution that's truly democratic and accountable and not get out of control? And here's the problem. When we think of the revolution as a constitutional event, we think of the U.S. Constitution. But that's not the first constitution in America. All 13 colonies become, during the revolution, states. And every state has to have a constitution. And so, in fact, Massachusetts is one of the first colonies to start this process. When they started during the Revolution, they used the state legislature, which has already been elected, to draft it and vote on the state constitution. They never sent it to the people. The Constitution is voted first by the state legislature, and they ratify it. And people in towns in Berkshire County freak out. And they say, you haven't consulted us. Who is this revolutionary for? And what are they trying to do? They're trying to figure out this doctrine, what we call popular sovereignty, right? If the idea is you're making a revolution, you're forming a new government in the name of the people. How does the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution start? We the people, right? If you're going to do that, you're going to have to consult the citizens first, right? White male taxpayers with property. And this man, right here in Pittsfield, is the most important person in that whole process. Without him, you don't have a state constitution that's ratified in Massachusetts, and you may not have had a U.S. Constitution that itself goes through a ratification process, right? We would like to say that it's just George Washington and John Adams and Madison who foist the Constitution on the people of America. No, no. They drafted it, and then they sent it to the people to vote on, right? The people had a say. Why did the people have a say? I would argue because this really wacky guy, Reverend Thomas Allen in Pittsfield, was very upset, right, that the state legislature in Massachusetts did not consult the people. Allen, also like Agrippa Hall, born in Northampton, right? Born in 1743, a young man, went to Yale, but came up from a poor family, of poor farmers, not well-to-do, and he was a little idiosyncratic. He becomes the pastor for the first Congregational Church in Pittsfield. At this time, in the 1760s, a small farming community. By the early 1770s, he's a radical patriot. He's in the militia. His brother is very much a patriot agitator, and they really, really don't like British policy. Okay? Famously, maybe you've heard of the Battle of Bennington, right, in 1777. This is part of the Saratoga campaign. right? Burgoyne sends men off to the east into Vermont to grab weapons and ammo, and Colonel John Stark from New Hampshire sends men west to intercept him, right? That will be a Patriot victory, but maybe only because Reverend Allen says the men of Berkshire County must show up. He organizes men in Pittsfield and sends the Berkshire militia. They show up at the last minute. None of them have any military experience. They're total novices, but famously, Thomas Allen becomes known as the Fighting Parsons, right? Because he jumps into the action at Bennington, maybe shoots a couple British soldiers. I think he's known for capturing a British officer during that small battle, but important battle in the Saratoga campaign, and becomes legendary for that. Well, less known about the Fighting Parsons is, in fact, in 1778, he writes something called a vindication. A vindication. And what is the vindication? You can go see it today in the Lenox archives. With my students and I, we went to see this extraordinary document. It is one of the most indecipherable, unreadable, indigestible political tracts you've ever encountered. I shudder to think what his Sunday sermons were like. They were much longer than what you're hearing today, I guarantee you, and much less coherent. But to boil it down to a radical idea, Allen says, you elites out in Boston, you've tried to form this Constitution without consulting us. What is really going on in here? Remember those courts that were shut down in '74? The courts are still happening during the Revolution, and what are they doing? Men who hold mortgages are collecting those mortgages on poor farmers during the Revolution, right? And they have no functioning courts really out here. And so there's a real struggle over land and resources in Berkshire County. And Reverend Allen is channeling that friction and resentment, right? And he's saying, you know what? We're not going to wage a revolution if you can't have a constitution that protects our rights, right? We need legal procedure. We need property rights, right? We need protections. And it's only because Reverend Allen issues this famous protest, organizes the men of northern Berkshire County, that the good men in Boston at the Massachusetts state legislature, they decide we're going to go back to the drawing board, we're going to form a new constitutional convention, and this time we will send it back to the towns. And in fact, they vote until they get it right. Right? By 1780, Massachusetts has a constitution. And this one has been voted on by the people of Massachusetts. And for that, we have Mr. Allen in Berkshire County to thank. Why do I bring up the Constitution at all? Because this gets us to one of the last but greatest stories of the American Revolution here in Berkshire County, which is to say that slavery in Massachusetts would not have been abolished, or maybe as fast as it, without this woman hearing about the Massachusetts Constitution from all evidence that we have and saying it should apply to me. It should apply to me. Who is this? Some of you may have heard of her. You know of her. That is, at the time, she was known as Mumbet. Today, we know her as Elizabeth Freeman. That is the name she takes on after she is emancipated. She's born in Claverack in New York around 1745. She's born to a Dutch family, the Higgabums or Hogeboms. When the Revolutionary War started, she was enslaved by Colonel John Ashley. Why was she enslaved by Ashley? Because Ashley had married a Dutch woman in the Dutch Hudson family. So he inherited Mumbet, Elizabeth Freeman, several other slaves. They have an incredible farm, but a series of businesses. Ashley's an incredibly wealthy man. He's got a sawmill, he's got a grist mill. He's involved in all these land deals here in southern Berkshire County. He's a mover and a shaker, but we don't like to acknowledge this in New England. I get it, it makes us very uncomfortable, but like many well-to-do men, right, and even middling men in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, he owned a few slaves. Now, this is not the slavery that you associate with Virginia or South Carolina. This is not a large plantation, but he does have usually what the case in New England is. They're domestic servants, where they're doing farm, agricultural labor of some kind or some mechanical trade. And that's what Mumbet is doing at the time of the American Revolution. She's an incredible person. People who knew her, much like Agrippa Hall, wrote a lot about her. She was known for being incredibly compassionate. She apparently had expertise as a midwife, as a healer, had a lot of folk knowledge, but she is enslaved by Ashley and his wife. And I say wife because from all available evidence that we have, I'm sorry to tell you, Ashley probably wasn't the worst slave owner. He probably was generally nice to Mumbet. Who wasn't so nice to Mumbet? Ashley's wife, who was known to be somewhat brutal with their servants, as the polite term was called at the time. Why is this such an interesting story? Because, people are complicated, right? People are contradictory. Ashley is a slave owner, but, lots of people own slaves, right? Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. He's going to say all men are created equal, right? It's complicated. Ashley is a militia captain. He's signing on to the Sheffield Resolve. He's part of this patriot agitation in southern Berkshire County. And Mumbet, guess what she's doing every time these radical men come to talk politics at Ashley's house? That's where they come. They come to Ashley's study. You can go there today and visit. They come and hang out there. She's serving them. We don't have any evidence that she's literate, but she's got 2 ears and 2 eyes, right? And she's listening and hearing everything. Okay? She lives through the Revolution. Ashley, particularly his son, right, fight in the Revolution, and then at 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution is read from the steps of the First Congregational Church on Sheffield. And the story is, we don't have any other sources, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But the story is Mumbet hears the preamble to the Massachusetts Constitution being read on the steps of the church. And what is that preamble, folks? All men are born free and equal. That's our Constitution in this state. To this day, all men are born free and equal, and they have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. The right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, and that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, as you know. I famously got a little Thomas Jefferson in there. Seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness as well. And Mumbet, from all we know, heard those words. She heard this kind of discourse, and she says, this should apply to me. This should apply to me. How do we know that? Because one of Colonel John Ashley's friends with this chap, Theodore Sedgwick, he's a very, very up-and-coming, very smart lawyer. After the Revolution, he will become, I think it's the second or third Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. As a Federalist. He is allied with George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Madison, the Federalist Party, the anti-Jeffersonians. At this time, Sedgwick is a young and up-and-coming country lawyer. I think he's originally from Connecticut. He is in Sheffield and downtown, and he's always hanging out with Ashley, and they're always talking politics. Mumbet goes to Sedgwick's house. She knows he's a lawyer, and she makes an appeal. File a writ for freedom. File a writ for freedom. And that is what Sedgwick does, famously. In I think you can see it right here, in 1781, he files on behalf of Mumbet, and the male slave in the same Ashley household, Brahm, a writ of replevin. This is like a writ saying, property that doesn't own, you don't own this property, you need to let it go, right? That's the legal term, writ of replevin, in the Berkshire County courts. And after several months, they have a court they have a legal proceeding, they have a trial, and famously, they determine that Mumbet is free. The lawsuit is filed right here in Great Barrington, the Court of Common Pleas, on May 28, 1781, on the grounds that Ashley has no right to Brahm and Bet, to their labor, demanded their release. Of course Ashley refused. He said, I have a right of servitude in the persons of the said Brahm and Bet. But by August 21st, 1781, the men of Berkshire County, right? Men who some of whom may have been slave owners themselves, right? But men who had lived through the Revolution, who took these ideas seriously. They say Brahm and Bet are not, and were not at the time of the purchase, the legal Negro servants of him, the said John Ashley, during their life. And they demand that they be freed, and Ashley paid them 30 shillings each in damages. Why? Because he's been taking their labor without paying them. This is the crack in the dam of slavery. There have been men, slave men, who fought with the Continentals, who fought with the Massachusetts Mission, who demanded their freedom. They submitted petitions, but Massachusetts has done nothing about it. It's been up to individual decisions of owners to free their slaves. It's because Mumbet files this lawsuit, and then a man named Quack Walker in Worcester files a lawsuit a couple months later, that the state courts in Massachusetts said, we will not recognize slave property based on the Massachusetts Constitution, right? We now have a Constitution. The Constitution says we will not recognize slavery, and that's the interpretation. That's how slavery ends in Massachusetts. There's no law that says there's no slavery. It's an act of judicial interpretation based on the Constitution, based on the fact that Elizabeth Freeman made this lawsuit. Okay, so let's see if my clicker will do its magic anymore. I thought I'd replace the bathroom. Last but not least here, let's see if this works. Last but not least, when we talk about the revolution and its aftermath, it not only ends slavery here in Massachusetts, right? You not only have the state constitution with all these classically liberal rights, you also have this problem of these men that Reverend Allen was so interested in defending. These men who, in Boston, they were mobbing and rioting and tarring and feathering people. Well, out here in Western Massachusetts, we've got a lot of poor farmers, right? And the Massachusetts economy, much like economies after wars, is a wreck. You have the dirty I word, inflation, right? There's not enough specie, hard money, gold and silver going around to pay taxes and to facilitate transactions. And in 1785, Congress says, hey, we've got $3 million to pay off all the debts, paying off all the soldiers and their back pay from the Revolution. And guess what? Congress can't do, the Continental Congress, because there's no Constitution. They can't collect taxes themselves. What are the only bodies that can collect taxes in the United States? The states. And so just like a mob boss, right? Philadelphia comes around and says, you're going to pay up all you states. And these states put the hammer down. If you can believe this, I was shocked to find this out. In Massachusetts in 1786, to pay the 1785 requisition, the good people of Massachusetts are paying 5 times more in taxes than they were in 1770. 5 times more taxes. They can't export goods because Britain has put an embargo on the West Indies. Britain won't buy stuff anymore. There's not enough gold and silver. The economy is a disaster, right? And in this environment, it will not shock you that these poor farmers, right, who just participated in the greatest adventure of their lives, lucky to survive it, right? If they weren't killed in combat, they were surely killed, more of them by disease and starvation, right? They remember what they did when the government wasn't accountable in 1774 in Great Barrington. What did they do? They went down to Great Barrington and they shut down the courts. And a man named Daniel Shays from Pelham starts this movement that quickly spreads, where these poor farmers, many of them veterans, many of the militia say, we're not going to give up our farms to pay taxes, right, just to pay off bondholders in Boston, all these men who have all these bonds. We don't have bonds, right? And they start to shut down the courts. And you can imagine things get out of control really quickly. Daniel Shays, this starts in August of '86. They shut down the Northampton courts. It spreads throughout New England. By January, he marches on the arsenal in Springfield. You can go there today. The federal arsenal, the army. He's there to grab guns and powder. But these are, as we say, summer soldiers, not winter soldiers. The state militia fire 1 cannon shot at Shays and his men, and they scatter. They run away. And that's the end of Shays, or so I thought. In fact, Shays' rebellion festers in Berkshire County, because it's not so easy for Boston militiamen to get up into these Berkshire hills, right? And there's a lot of, as we call them, agrarians out here in Berkshire County. And in fact, the last battle of Shays' rebellion, I did not know this until I studied this, the last battle is fought just down the road in Sheffield, and that is the monument up there in the upper left-hand corner, recently renovated.
That is the last battle site. You can't make this stuff up. Literally, men from Stockbridge and Lenox rampage through Stockbridge and Lenox, terrorizing people, invading the homes of wealthy men like Theodore Sedgwick, who now had a nice estate there in Stockbridge. They invaded his house. Allegedly, this is just anecdote, so I cannot confirm it, but allegedly, Mom Pet, Elizabeth Freeman, grabbed Theodore Sedgwick's silver, put it in the basement, and made sure these Shayshites didn't get it. They grabbed a couple of hostages, and then they marched south to Great Barrington. This is February 1786. They get to Great Barrington, and they carouse, and they drink, and they mob, and then they hear that William Williams, who's a judge in Lenox, is coming to get them, and they shift west to get to the New York state line. And they are intercepted in Sheffield. They have a hostage. Fire is exchanged. The hostage is shot and killed. A couple other men are mortally wounded. And then the party scattered. And that is, in fact, the last so-called battle of Shays' Rebellion. It happens right here. And it raises the question for us, my friends, I would say, right? It raises this question. Who is the American Revolution for, right? Is it for these poor white farmers? Is it for elite lawyers, right? Is it for enslaved women? Is it for the religious zealots among us, Mr. Allen? You know, is it for free black men? Is it for Native Americans, right? Who is this revolution for? Is it for the German Hessians, many of whom come here as mercenaries, and what do? They desert, and they leave because they hear the word liberty. They hear the word liberty, and they think maybe it applies to them too. They desert the British Army. Who is this revolution for? My friends, I would say if we only look around the corner, we look right here into the local history of Berkshire County and how it plays its part in these momentous events of the American Revolution, I will submit to you, it suggests to us that the American Revolution is for all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you. So much. I hope you appreciate how difficult a task that was, cramming all of those lectures into what, 1 hour. I did keep it to 1 hour. Yes, yes, yes. I hope by promoting these sites, these monuments, these portraits, these documents, you do not need to be a professional historian with a PhD to go see these, to go touch these, to go read these and hold these and look at them. You can go to all these sites, you can make the appointment, you can make the drive, and I'm telling you, it'll be well worth your experience to do that. You do not have to go to the Freedom Trail. God bless the Freedom Trail, but we have our own liberty, how should you put it, highway here in Berkshire County. So please take advantage of it. Should I take questions?
Yes.
Oh, please, I'd be happy to take questions. Again, I only skim the surface of many of these events. I wish we recorded all my lectures this spring, but sadly we did not. So, but I'd be happy to answer what I can. Yes, please. Yes.
How did the farmers and other people who were, maybe some of them became part of Shays' Rebellion, how did they afford, or how did the states afford to raise all that money that they were supposed to raise, or did they?
Good question. Good question. Massachusetts never raised all the money for that position. It never did. And one reason for that is because this rebellion had such, I'm always loath to tell my students that violence works because I don't want people to get in trouble. But in this case, protest and violence did sort of work in a weird way, right? Because very few of these Shayshites were punished. A lot of them were arrested, only a couple of them were hanged, including a couple men in Berkshire County, but most of them just escaped. The real effect of Shays' Rebellion is the tumult was so shocking to the established here in Massachusetts and New England and the nation. This is one reason why James Madison and others say we have to have a constitution that collects taxes at the national level and has a standing army that can invade the states. Right? You may not like that, Los Angeles, but that's why we have a central government, right? If things get out of control in one state, Washington can send troops, right? Washington, D.C., right? Things get so out of control that when the elections of 1787 happened, they throw out the governor, Hancock, they get a new governor in Massachusetts, and there's a 70% turnover in the state legislature. And so what have they done? They just got rid of all those men who were trying to collect taxes here in Massachusetts. So in fact, they never collect those taxes. It's the Constitution itself, right, which allows taxation to go from the states to the nation. And famously, Alexander Hamilton, you all know of him because of this incredible musical opera we now have, right? Alexander Hamilton's genius, one of his geniuses, is to say in the Federalist Papers, through that propaganda, if you states ratify the Constitution, then we will make sure that the national government assumes all of the state debts from the Revolution. We will pay it centrally. So he removes that burden from ordinary taxpayers and he puts it on Pennsylvania farmers, and that's why you get the whiskey tax, and that's why you get the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. That's a different rebellion. But essentially, all which is to say it plays out in local politics. There's a political backlash, and these poor farmers don't pay much of that afterwards. So, you know, hey, sometimes protest works. Not all the times, but sometimes, yes.
We all know that after the Revolution, they fought the Articles of Confederation, and they failed. And what were the Articles of Confederation, and why did they fail?
That's an excellent question, kind of a perfect question, a follow-up question. The Articles of Confederation, you have to recall that. Well, in fact, those are consolidated in 1777. So at the beginning of the Revolution, they're in effect, in theory. The Articles of Confederation is what passes for a central government during the Revolution. And by pass, I mean it's almost not a central government at all. Its only function is to sign treaties and to wage war. That's it. It cannot collect taxes. It cannot regulate trade, nothing. All those powers we now associate with the central government, that's the Constitution of '88. Those powers were all delegated to the states. And there's a really good reason for that from the perspective of the revolutionaries, which is what? You're having a revolution against
Central power.
central power. You wouldn't recreate what you're trying to destroy that was just oppressing you. So you create 13 little republics, little r republics, and that's what these states are. They each have a legislature, they each have a court system, and they each have a governor. And they're all accountable to the voters in those colonies turned states. So the Articles of Confederation has none of that, except it does have a Congress. It's called the Continental Congress, and each colony turned state has one representative to the Continental Congress. And they can make decisions about war and diplomacy, that's it. But here's the real rub about the Articles of Confederation Congress. To make any decision, they have to have a supermajority. 9 out of 13 delegates have to say yes. To change the articles themselves, all 13 delegates have to say yes. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to run an organization where you get everyone to agree on everything. Good luck, good luck. Just trying to get a majority to agree on something, a simple majority, 51% plus 1, or 50% plus 1, that's virtually difficult. I mean, check out American politics today, right? So this was a recipe for disaster. The Articles were perfect for a revolutionary society in motion trying to win a war against centralized tyranny. Really bad for trying to manage a complex, diverse, boisterous, dynamic society that America was. So it's in fact, I would say, Shays' Rebellion more than anything that convinces American elites who are already a little unhappy with how limited this national government was. It's Shays' Rebellion that pushes them to really want a central government. Yes, it's about internal rebellion and external rebellion, but it's also about representation. James Madison, you should read it, right? Writes this thing called Federalist Number 10. And in Federalist Number 10, he says, faction is the death of all republics. By faction, he means political parties. Why political parties are selfish. And he says, what's the source of all faction and all republics, Property, the division of property. Right? What is he really talking about? He's talking about Shays' Rebellion. He's talking about these poor farmers who want governments to issue paper money so they can use it to pay off their debts at a discount. He's talking about governments that want to pay back bondholders, government bondholders, not at a discount, but at the full value, right? Even as those bonds are depreciating, right? That's what he's talking about. And his genius, Madison's genius, is to say, let's remove these big political questions, war, finance, let's remove them from the states, which are too democratic, to the nation, which is less democratic. And that's part of his genius. And thank goodness, because I'm not sure we'd have a country if he hadn't done that. Too many interests, too diverse a country, right? You've got to have some stability somewhere, or else that sucker is just centrifugal forces, they just fly off. Right? Yes, question, yes.
Yeah, so pre-war, right, of course, the general sense of the British is you're a bunch of ingrates, you couldn't have this without us. To what degree among the framers was that broad position taken seriously, or was that just summarily, was it just the cat was out of the bag and they were going to go for it?
You mean what part of the population was pro-revolution?
Or what part of the folks who wrote the Constitution gave some thought to the possibility that there was a way to do this that was not full revolution?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question. John Adams himself famously said that 1/3 of the population was patriotic, was pro-revolutionary. 1/3 of the population didn't care either way, and 1/3 of the population was loyalist. That's not really true. In fact, in most colonies, loyalists are 20% or less of the population. And in even really radical places like Boston, Massachusetts, we're even smaller as a percentage of the population. Where the war gets really nasty in New Jersey, South Carolina, those are colonies with large loyalist populations. Folks, I'm trying to give you a little taste of it here, but we barely got into that with the Great Barrington Court closures. The American Revolution is a civil war. It's a civil war within the British Empire, right? And it's often in places like New Jersey, even in the small towns in Massachusetts. It's neighbors versus neighbors, right? It's people not being very nice to each other, even before the Revolutionary War takes off. So there's always a loyalist element, and those people either are intimidated into staying out of it, or in fact, with many of them, their property is confiscated and they're forced to leave the country. You know, I just found this out. My wife's family has Canadians. You know, well, how did they get to Canada? They fled Massachusetts. You know, this was a shocker to me. I thought I was dyed-in-the-wool red, white, and blue-blooded Yankee, but apparently I married into a disloyal family. There is a fact. There's a percentage of the population, elites, who are pro-loyalist. I think the more interesting faction is there's this middle group of people, like John Dickinson. Read his letters from an American farmer, right? John Dickinson. He says, you know what? We don't like Parliament's policies, but at the end of the day, we're British. We're just British. And if we leave that, what will we be? We won't be anything, right? And he's right. We had to invent a new identity, this thing called Americans, right? And that's scary. That's scary. So there's always a percentage of people who are skeptical, who are reluctant, and they're forced to choose sides. To me, the really interesting thing about the 1780s, the Constitution, is you have veterans, men who've proven their patriotism, like Daniel Shays. I mean, look at these guys. They're menacing. These are veterans. They're soldiers. They've got their sabers. They've got their guns, right? They bled in the Revolution. They've served. They're being accused of being secret British sympathizers, right? Maybe they want to carve off Vermont and give it to Britain. Maybe they want to carve off the New York frontier and give it to Britain. They're not true Americans. Well, this is baloney. I mean, these guys are all veterans, but what you have to remember is that 1780s, America is a vast space on the Atlantic seaboard. This new United States, it's very weak, it's very small, and it doesn't have an army or navy like Britain or France or Spain to speak of. And so at this time, it's a fledgling republic, very weak, very vulnerable. And so that's why, in one way, the Constitution is so important. It's only the Constitution that allows this republic both to defend itself, like the War of 1812, but also expand across the continent. Right? I don't know if that answers your question. Complicated answer. I hope I gave some help.
Didn't George Washington send the troops to put down the Shays Rebellion? How did that affect his standing, because it turns out that the people really supported Shea.
That's a good point. Washington doesn't send troops because again, that's Article of Confederation. There is no standing army. There's no federal army. There's only state
Did he
militias.
order it though?
He's not the commanding general at the time, so I don't know if he could have ordered it. What did happen is the governor of Massachusetts, Hancock, he did organize the state militia, and he sent them to crush the rebellion. Well, folks, how did they afford that, right? There's no money. Guess who paid for the state militia? All the merchants in Boston who owned those bonds. They literally put out the money to pay for the militia to come out. So no, Washington's not part of that. I mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington is part of a small federal army that goes to crush the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania. That's in 1794, but that's because the Constitution gives him a standing army, and of course, as president, he's commander-in-chief. And my friends, this is incredible. That is the only time any president has ever gone into the field with soldiers in American history, is to crush American citizens in 1794, which is pretty neat. So, other questions, comments? No, I will release you from this non-air conditioned, allegedly air conditioned space.